That moment, you're sitting in your house completely alone. It's quiet. You're reading or watching something, or just existing in the specific, comfortable way you exist in a space you know well. And then a sound from upstairs or from the room next door or from somewhere below the floor. And for 2 seconds, your whole body stops. Not because the sound was loud. Most of the time it isn't. But because your brain has cataloged every sound this house makes in every weather condition and temperature, and this sound isn't in the catalog. Most of the time you figure it out. The house settling, the pipes, a branch on the roof, the specific creak that happens when the temperature drops and the wood contracts. Most of the time there's an answer. Tonight, 3 stories from people whose answer never came. 3 houses, 3 sets of sounds, 3 things that turned out to be something other than the house settling. Let's go. I want to start by telling you that I am a project manager by profession. I manage timelines, I track deliverables, I build systems for capturing information and finding the patterns in it. That's not a small detail. It's the reason this story went where it went. Because when I started having a problem I couldn't solve, I did what I do. I built a system to capture it. And the system showed me something I genuinely wish it hadn't. My name is June, I'm 43. Cal is my husband. We bought our house 3 years ago, a 1,940 Craftsman in a mid-sized city, the kind of house that has character in the way older houses do. It creaks and settles and breathes differently than a new build. And we knew that, we liked that, we bought it specifically because we wanted something with history. The previous owner had been an elderly woman who'd lived in the house for 52 years. She died in the house 18 months before we bought it, in the master bedroom, which is now our bedroom. We knew this. The disclosure was clear. It was not a secret. Cal had a brief moment of hesitation. I said that more people have died in houses than most people want to think about, and that 52 years of good life in a house was something to be respected, not feared. We moved in. The first few months were unremarkable. The house made its house sounds. We learned them. We stopped noticing them. Then, around month 4, something changed. The first sound I couldn't account for was a knock. Not a loud knock, not a dramatic 3 knock on a door, a single quiet knock from somewhere inside the wall of the upstairs hallway, the way a pipe makes a knock when the water pressure shifts. But it wasn't a water pipe. I checked. Our plumber had been through during the inspection. The pipe layout didn't correspond to that section of wall. It happened at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I noted it, told Cal. He listened at the wall and heard nothing. We moved on. 3 days later, same sound, same wall. 6:47 a.m. I noted it again. This time I wrote down the time. I want to tell you what the sound log looked like by the end of the first month. Because by the end of the first month, I had 12 documented incidents, and I'd been thorough about every one. Time, location in the house, quality and duration of the sound, weather conditions, temperature, whether the heat or AC had been running, 12 incidents, and already a pattern I couldn't fully see yet but could feel at the edge of my understanding. The way a shape emerges in a magic eye image before your brain has consciously registered it. The knock in the hallway wall, twice, 6:47 a.m. A sound from the kitchen, twice. Specific, the sound of a cabinet door being opened and allowed to swing slowly closed on its pneumatic hinge, around 7:15 a.m. Footsteps, the specific sound of weight on the hardwood floor of the upstairs hallway, 3 times, 8 a.m., moving from the bedroom toward the bathroom, 6 steps, consistent. A sound from the back of the house, the rear bedroom we used as an office, like a chair being shifted on hardwood once around 9:30 a.m. And one sound, twice in the first month, that I had the most difficulty assigning to any mechanical source. A sound from the living room, late in the afternoon, around 4:30 p.m., like a television being turned on. The specific sound of the initial static burst of an older set coming to life, even though our television made no such sound. By month 2, I had 31 documented incidents. I built a spreadsheet: time, location, sound type, duration, frequency. I sorted by time of day, and there it was. not a random distribution across the 24-hour day, a cluster between 6:30 a.m. and 7:30 a.m., a consistent sequence of sounds in a consistent order: the hallway knock, the kitchen cabinet, footsteps to the bathroom. Around 9:30 a.m., the chair in the back room. Around noon, what sounded like movement in the kitchen, again, a faint clattering I'd attributed to Cal the first few times until I confirmed he was at work. Around 4:30 p.m., the television sound. Around 8 p.m., footsteps from the living room to the bedroom. Around 10 p.m., the hallway knock again. A schedule, a day, someone's day organized and consistent, repeating across weeks. I asked our neighbor, Mrs. Hartwick, about the previous owner. Mrs. Hartwick had lived next door for 30 years. She'd known the woman well. I want to be careful about how I tell you this next part, because I'm going to tell you what Mrs. Hartwick described, and I'm going to let you place it against the schedule I've just laid out and draw your own conclusion. Mrs. Hartwick said the previous owner had been a creature of absolute habit. She said she woke up at the same time every day for as long as I knew her, 6:30, 6:45, never varied. You could set your watch. I said, and her mornings? What did she do in the mornings? Mrs. Hartwick said, coffee first, always coffee. She'd go to the kitchen. You could hear the cabinet where she kept her mugs. Old cabinet that never sat quite right, always made a sound when she opened it. She said, then upstairs, she'd dress in the bathroom. She was very particular about her routine. Bathroom first, then her desk in the back room where she did her correspondence. She said lunch at home most days. She didn't go out much toward the end. She said afternoon she watched her program. She liked the afternoon television. She had an old set she refused to replace because she said modern televisions gave her headaches. She said in evenings she'd move herself to bed by 8. She was an early sleeper. Health reasons. I sat across from Mrs. Hartwick and I let her finish. And then I said very carefully, what time did she usually go to sleep, Mrs.? Hartwick said, by 10, usually. She'd read a bit first. I'd see her bedroom light on, then dark by 10:30. I said, the back room she used as her office. Was there a specific chair she used? Mrs. Hartwick said, a wooden desk chair, old thing, made a terrible noise on the floor when she moved it. I said, Mrs. Hartwick, the house we bought when she was alive, and in that house, what did her days sound like? Mrs. Hartwick looked at me. Then she said, like what you're describing, not a question, a recognition. I've added to the sound log for 2 years now. The schedule hasn't changed. 6:47 a.m., the knock. 7:15 a.m., the cabinet. 8 a.m., 6 steps to the bathroom. 9:30 a.m., the chair. Every single day. Cal heard the cabinet sound on his own one morning. Clear, unmistakable. He came downstairs and I was still in bed and he said, the kitchen cabinet sound? I said, yes. He sat down at the table. He said, it's every day, isn't it? I said, yes. He said, what do we do with that? And I said the thing I'd been working toward for 2 months of spreadsheets and timestamps and patterns. I said, I think we let her have her day. We still live in the house. We've made a kind of peace with it. Not an uneasy peace, something quieter than that. The sounds are the sounds of a woman who lived 52 years in a place she loved, who drank her coffee at 7:15 and watched her programs at 4:30 and went to bed by 10. She's not frightening. She's not threatening. She's just there, going through her day in the house she spent her life in. And most mornings when I hear the cabinet, I think, good morning. I don't say it out loud, but I think it. And sometimes on the very quiet mornings, I think she hears me. Hey, before story 2, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe right now. This is what we do every week. Real stories, real houses, real sounds that turned out to be something that doesn't have a clean explanation. And drop a comment. Tell me what you would have done with June's spreadsheet. Would you have stayed in the house? Because story 2 is about a house where the sounds weren't coming from the walls or the floors. They were coming from below the floor. In a house with no basement. I need to tell you about the sound first, before I tell you what we found, because the finding only makes sense if you understand what the sound was doing to us over the 3 weeks before we opened the floor. It started on our third night in the house, which was a Tuesday in March. We were in bed, lights off. The specific heavy quiet of a house you haven't learned yet. And from somewhere below where we were lying, below the bedroom floor, a sound. Rhythmic, slow, patient. The best description I've been able to settle on after 2 years of trying to describe it accurately is this. It sounded like something being dragged, slowly, a few inches at a time, with a pause between each drag. Not loud, not insistent, just present, just there, in the floor beneath us. We lay in bed and listened to it for what felt like a long time, probably 10 minutes, and then it stopped. We did not talk about it that night. In the morning, we told each other it was probably the pipes, probably an animal under the house, probably the foundation settling in the early spring temperature shift. Probably, my name is Lorenzo, I'm 40, Suki is my wife. We'd bought the house 3 months prior, and this was our first extended stay after the closing. We'd been renovating for the time between closing and moving in. The house was a mid-century split level built in 1958, 3 bedrooms, no basement listed in the documentation. This was not unusual for houses of that era in that region. Slab foundations were common, crawl space foundations were common, full basements less so. When I got under the house to check on the animal theory, standard crawl space access from an exterior vent on the east side, I found a clean, undisturbed crawl space with no sign of animal occupation, no tracks, no nesting material, no scat. The mechanical systems were along the north and south walls. The floor above was standard joist construction. I could not find any source for the sound. I could also not locate from the crawl space the section of floor that was directly below our bedroom, which I noted but didn't fully process the significance of at the time. The sound continued on night 4, night 5, night 7. Not every night, which was its own quality of disturbing. The unpredictability of it, the nights we lay in bed waiting for it and it didn't come, were almost worse than the nights it did. On the 9th night, it changed. Not the quality of the sound, not the rhythm, but the location. It had started below the bedroom. On night 9, it was below the living room. Suki sat up in bed. I sat up in bed. We looked at each other in the dark. She said, "Did it move?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Can something move under the floor between different rooms?" I said, "It depends on what it is." She said, "What do you think it is?" I said, "I don't know." I called a contractor named Ruiz on the 10th day, a man I'd worked with during the renovation who knew the house construction well. I described the sound, the location, the migration from one room to another. I told him I'd been in the crawl space and couldn't find the source or locate the section of floor below the living room from that access. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You said the house is a 58 split level?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Some of those builds have anomalies in the subfloor, pockets, sealed sections, usually from modification work done by previous owners who didn't want to deal with a problem the right way. They'd sometimes just close off a section rather than fix whatever was wrong with it." I said, "What kind of problem would you close off?" He said, "Water intrusion mostly, sometimes structural." Sometimes he paused. Sometimes people sealed things off for reasons that weren't construction related. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You'd be surprised what people put under floors." Ruiz came on a Thursday. Suki stayed home from work. He pulled the living room rug and examined the floor surface. He found it in 40 minutes. A seam in the hardwood floor that didn't correspond to any standard floorboard layout. A rectangular seam, about 3 feet by 4 feet. The wood matching the surrounding floor so closely that you'd never see it unless you knew what you were looking for. Access panel. He looked up at me. He said, "You want me to open it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Whatever's under there, the smell is going to be significant." I said, "What kind of smell?" He said, "Sealed space. Could be water, could be mold, could be something else. Just be ready." He worked the seam with a flat bar for several minutes. The panel lifted. The smell was not what I expected. Not mold, not water, not rot. Dry, old. the specific smell of a space that has been sealed for a very long time and simply accumulated the scent of time and wood and settled dust. And something else underneath that, something organic, I couldn't name it immediately. Ruiz shone his work light down into the opening. Below the panel, a space. Not a standard crawl space, a proper room. Low ceilinged, but enough height to crouch in, maybe 4 feet. The floor below was earthen, packed dirt. He said, there's a room down here. I said, I know. He said, this is not in any of the building documents. I said, I know. Suki was standing behind me. I heard her move. I heard her stop. Ruiz lowered himself into the space. He was down there for maybe 3 minutes, and I stood at the edge of the opening, listening to his footsteps in the dirt below, and the house was very quiet. And I realized something in that quiet that I hadn't noticed until that moment. The sound had stopped. Not just tonight, the sound that had been coming from below the living room floor for 3 weeks. The slow, rhythmic dragging was not there. From the moment the panel had come up, the sound had stopped. Whatever had been making it, it had stopped when the floor opened, like it had been asking to be found. Ruiz came back up. He said, there's something down there. I said, what kind of something? He said, there's a chair. I said, a chair. He said, a wooden chair, old, sitting in the middle of the dirt floor. And around the chair. He paused. He said, personal effects. A small collection of them. Arranged around the chair. Photographs. Some clothing. Very old. Folded. A few objects I can't identify. Suki said, whose are they? He said, I don't know. I went down. The space was low and close and smelled of decades of sealed air. And in the center of the packed dirt floor was a wooden chair, a straight-backed dining chair, with the specific wear of something used regularly. The finish gone from the armrests, the seat compressed, and around it, exactly as Ruiz had said, a collection of objects arranged in a rough circle, photographs face up, folded clothing, a few small items, a hairbrush, a pair of reading glasses, the kind of objects that belong to a specific person. The photographs were of people I didn't recognize. A woman, primarily, in photographs spanning several decades of style, the 1,960 seconds, through what appeared to be the 1,990 seconds. The most recent photograph was of an elderly woman sitting in a chair, a specific chair, the chair in front of me, in the room below the floor. We had this space investigated by the county, which found no evidence of anything that required their continued involvement. The chair and the objects were removed and processed. The space was sealed properly. The previous owners of the house, a family who'd sold it 15 years prior, were contacted. The county spoke to them, not me. I never got the full account, just fragments through the process. What I know is that an elderly member of that family had developed a habit of going below the floor in her later years, that the access panel had been built for her, that she'd spent significant time in the chair below the living room, and that when she died, the family had sealed the panel and listed the house. Why she went down there, what the space meant to her, why she preferred it to any room in the house above, nobody could tell me. What I know is that from the night Ruiz opened that floor, I have never heard the sound again. Not once. The house is quiet now, completely quiet. And sometimes in the specific way that a silence can be as present as a sound. I'm aware of the earthen floor below the living room, 3 feet of wood and joists between me and the packed dirt, and the circle of objects that used to surround a chair. And I wonder what she was doing down there, what she found in that sealed space, in that chair, in that dark, that brought her back to it so many times that the sound of her moving in it became the sound of the house itself. I think about that, and then I go upstairs, and the house is quiet, and I try to be grateful for that. I want to tell you about the first time I heard it, because the first time I wasn't frightened. That's the part that surprises people when I tell them. They expect me to say I was terrified from the beginning, but I wasn't. The first time I heard it, I just stood in the kitchen doorway and felt a rush of something close to confused joy. because it sounded like a child, a real child. And for just a second, my brain processed it as exactly that, someone's kid in my house. And I thought, where did a child come from? And then I remembered, no child lives here. No child had a reason to be in my house. My daughter Nell was at college. The neighborhood was mostly older couples. I was alone in my house. And there was a child's voice in it. My name is Daria. I'm 55. I've lived in my house for 11 years. It's a Dutch colonial in a residential neighborhood built in 1972. 4 previous owners before me. Nell grew up in this house. She left for college 3 years ago, and I've been rattling around in it since, which is a decision I keep meaning to revisit and never quite do. The first voice happened on a Wednesday in October, about a year ago. I was in the kitchen making lunch, and from somewhere in the direction of the living room, a child's voice, a girl's voice, young, maybe 7 or 8 by the pitch of it, said a single word, "Mama." That was it. Clear, complete, not a whisper and not loud. Conversational, the way a child calls to a parent in the next room when they need something. I walked to the living room doorway. Nobody there. I went through the house. Every room, nobody. I stood in the middle of the living room and felt that specific full body stillness that happens when something doesn't make sense and your nervous system is trying to figure out what to do next. Then I made lunch and told myself it had been outside, a neighbor child, sound through a window. The second time was 5 days later, not a single word this time, a partial sentence. And I want to be precise about what I heard because this is the part that eventually mattered. From the hallway, mid-afternoon, the voice said, "Put it back before she," then nothing. Like the middle of a conversation, lifted out of context, a fragment without its beginning or end. I wrote it down immediately, word for word, the way you write something down when you know you're going to need it later, even if you don't know why yet. I had learned from June, though I didn't know June then. I just had the instinct that documentation was the right response. I wrote it down. And I started listening differently over the following 4 months. I documented 23 utterances. I want to read some of them to you in the order I heard them, because the sequence matters. First, "Mama." Second, "Put it back before she." Third, a name, "Rosie." Said twice, with the specific, affectionate repetition of a child's name used in play. "Rosie, Rosie." Fourth, "I don't want to." Clearly resistant, the tone of a child being asked to do something. A year. Just a year. Said clearly, 1983. Said with the specific emphasis of a child who has just learned to say a year correctly and is pleased about it. Sixth, "The blue one is mine." Seventh, "Mama, I can hear," and then nothing. A different name, Carla. Not Carla from my name list, a new name. Said the way you say someone's name when you're telling them something. "It's too cold in here," said with feeling. A genuine complaint. By month 3, 20 utterances, and I had brought them to my daughter Nell on a phone call. I needed someone to know. And Nell is practical and honest and said, "Mom, you need to talk to someone who knows the history of the house." I said, "A historian?" She said, "The County Historical Society." Or a local historian, someone who knows who lived there before you. I found Dr. Osei, a retired historian who specialized in residential history in our county, who agreed to meet me and look at my documentation. I spread my notes on his table. 23 entries, dates, times, exact words, the 4 months of careful documentation. He read through them, slowly, his expression giving me nothing. When he was done, he looked up. He said, "I'm going to ask you something before I respond to any of this." I said, "Okay." He said, "When you moved into the house 11 years ago, did you receive any information about the family who owned the property in the early 1980 seconds?" I said, "I know there were multiple owners before me. I don't know the specific families." He said, "The family in the early 1980 seconds had a child." I said, "Most families with children." He said, "A daughter. She would have been approximately 7 years old in 1983. I went still. He said her name was in the property records as a secondary occupant during the insurance documentation from that period." He paused. He said, her name was Rosa. The family called her Rosie. I want to be careful about the next part because Dr. Osei asked me to be careful. He said the details of what happened to the family were private, that they had living relatives, that he wasn't in a position to share everything he knew. What he would tell me was this. Rosa, the daughter, had lived in the house until 1984. She had not lived in the house after 1984. The circumstances of her departure from the house were not something he could detail, but they were documented, and they were the kind of circumstances that a child of 7 would not have chosen. He looked at my list. He said, the name Carla, here in your 8th entry. I said, yes. He said Carla was the mother's name. I stopped breathing for a second. He pointed to the 5th entry, the year 1983. He said that was the last full year she was in that house. He pointed to the 7th entry, Mama, I can hear. He said, I don't know what she heard. I can't tell you what comes after that sentence. A long pause. Then he said very quietly, but I believe you heard it. I've lived in the house for a year since my conversation with Dr. Osei. The voice has continued. Not every week. Sometimes I don't hear it for a month. Sometimes I hear it 3 times in a week. Last month, she said something I hadn't heard before. She said, I like it here. 3 words, clear, warm. The specific tone of a child stating a preference with confidence. I stood in the middle of my living room with my hand over my mouth. And then I said out loud to the room, to whatever's in it, I said, I'm glad. The house was quiet, and I know how this sounds. I know what it sounds like to say that you've had a conversation with the voice of a child who hasn't been in your house since 1984. But I said it, and she said what she said. And whatever is in this house, this Dutch colonial that I've been rattling around in for 11 years since Nell left, whatever piece of a 7-year-old girl from 1983 is still in these walls, she likes it here. And I've decided that's something. I've decided that's enough. 3 houses. A woman going through her daily routine in a house she spent 52 years in. The coffee at 7:15. The programs at 4:30. The light off by 10. A sealed room below the living room floor. A chair in packed dirt, surrounded by a life arranged in a circle. A sound that stopped the moment it was found, like something that only needed to be acknowledged. And a child, or what remains of a child, who has been in a Dutch colonial since 1983, who says her mother's name and complains about the cold, and who in 40 years has apparently decided she likes it there. Here's the thing about a house. We talk about houses as structures, as real estate, as investments, as assets with square footage and comparable sales and market values. But a house is also time. Every person who lived in it, every morning coffee and afternoon television and late night creak on the stairs, every argument and celebration, an ordinary Tuesday, every life that was lived inside those walls left something. Most of the time you don't hear it. Most of the time the house just holds it quietly, the accumulated weight of all that time, all that living pressed into the wood and the walls and the floor. But sometimes, usually at night, usually in the quiet, usually when the noise of your own life goes down enough, you hear it, and then you have a decision to make. What you do with the sound that isn't in your catalog. June documented it and learned to say good morning. Lorenzo opened the floor and found a woman who needed to be found. Daria listened, and 4 months later, a child from 1983 told her she liked it there. 3 different sounds, 3 different answers. The house was talking all along. Good night.